I'm Peter Rao. Welcome to Counterbalance. This week, Mike and I have the pleasure of being joined by Matt Karnitschnig, who is the chief Europe correspondent at Politico, based out of Berlin. Matt spent many years working for the Wall Street Journal, 15 years to be exact, reporting out of the US and Europe, and then switched over to Politico, where he's been working for some time now as well. He's a native of Phoenix. He has an Austrian father and an American mother, so knows the German political scene through his German language skills quite well. And we look forward to hearing about European journalism and the state of play in Germany. All right, Matt Karnitschnig, welcome to Counterbalance.
Thank you for having me.
Matt, you, for many years, reported for the Wall Street Journal in the U.S. and in Europe. Now you're reporting for Politico out of Berlin. And I thought I would ask you what you see as some of the differences in American and European journalism. And part of the reason I asked that question, I don't know if you wrote this or if it was a conversation we had, but a few years ago, somehow I came up with you this German concept of the Autorisierung, the authorization, which we don't have in the U.S., where officials will go talk to reporters, and then afterwards they're allowed to review their quotes, perhaps ask for something to be struck or even edited, which of course in the US we don't have. But not just that example. Perhaps you could just talk a little bit what really is the difference between covering the beat in New York or in as compared to Berlin.
I would say that in general, reporters in Europe and in Germany in particular are much closer to the people they're covering than you would find in the United States or in the UK, for example. There's not as much of a confrontational type relationship, which I think we typically have in the sort of Anglo-Saxon world. Here, it is pretty common. In fact, it is very common in this current coalition to have senior journalists leave their positions and go to work as government spokesmen. In the U.S., that also happens, but it's typically people who, not to offend anybody, but over the years I've noticed it's not necessarily the top flight journalists that are going to go into PR. It's seen as actually a sign that your career didn't work out that well, and you kind of, you had to go to the dark side, as we say. In Germany, it's just the opposite. You've got people who were in the most senior positions, including a former editor of The Spiegel, who is now the deputy spokesman for the German government. And if you look at the kind of cadre of PR people for the German coalition at the moment, most of them were former journalists. And what that does is it kind of continues this system of coziness between their former publications or broadcast outlets and the government. And it gives the coverage, I think, this kind of a clubby feel to it, which is why I think you have a lot of things blow up here all of a sudden that nobody was prepared for. The latest example is the situation with the German budget, which some people might have heard about, this decision by the Constitutional Court here, which ruled the way the government had been financing itself to be illegal. Now, everybody was caught off guard by this, and I think that if you look at the way the system works here, one reason was that nobody was asking the tough questions about this. They were just kind of taking the government line as the gospel, and so you see that kind of thing happening quite a lot.
Is that because of the history in Europe of newspapers having a strong party affiliation, or is there something else going on?
I think there's something else going on, which is sort of the institutionalization of journalism here, which I think was intended to avoid the kind of extreme opinions that we have, say, in the United States. You don't really have that in the mainstream here. There is no Fox News. There's nobody who's really either to the far left, like an MSNBC, or to the right, like a Fox, or some of these other populist channels that have cropped up recently. You have a very robust public television sector, which is paid for by the taxpayers. Every household in Germany is forced to fund this operation to the tune of 9 billion euros a year. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's the most expensive public television system in the world. So you have, much of the press covering the government is working in this kind of public sector sphere. And even though they're not directly controlled by the government, there is, a certain influence that the government has over them. And I think that you definitely see that in the way they cover things. They're not as aggressive because they're also trying to ensure that they maintain their good relations with the people they cover. Now, that is something I think you see that a bit in the U.S. system, and people covering the White House. They don't want to be kind of shut out by their sources, by the people they're covering. You have that here, but it feels to me like it is a bit deeper, and it's been institutionalized to such a degree that it's very hard to kind of circumvent that, I think. Because you will be shut out if you're working domestically here as a reporter. If you're not playing this game, if you're not agreeing to authorize quotes, as they call it, and so forth, then you're not going to be invited to go on the plane with Chancellor Scholz to Dubai, or where he's going tomorrow, or whatever it might be. There are consequences. So there is kind of a contradiction here in the sense that you have a lot of media, there are a lot of newspapers, so there is a lot of competition, which normally you would think would be a good thing. But what it's done is it's led to this kind of culture that the government still is ultimately controlling the flow of information. And if you're not playing the game according to the rules as they see fit, then you're at a competitive disadvantage, if you see what I mean. And that's basically where they are. So it's a very kind of controlled environment.
Yeah, I mean, as I think of the trade-offs in the American context, there was a time in American broadcast journalism where essentially, to use the parlance of the day, 3 old white men in TV towers in New York sort of controlled and structured what the country was thinking, and people took their cues from that. And in a way, that gatekeeper function that someone like a Walter Cronkite provided meant that there was a quality to the press and to reporting. On the other hand, it concentrated an enormous amount of power in a few people. And of course, as we famously know, it was Johnson who said, "If I've lost," or was it Nixon? Johnson who said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America." So in a way, there's a trade-off between the helter-skelter, market-based push for clicks and for news. In a way, it democratizes the media. It lowers the barriers to entry. It means that no one source can overwhelm the country. On the other hand, it dilutes, the quality of some of the reporting, and it requires probably more of a discerning citizenry to know what it is they're reading. Is that a fair representation of what we're describing, or is that a little off?
No, I think that's right. I think if anything, that the Europeans, and maybe the Germans in particular, because of the strength of this public sector television, are kind of still stuck in that area where we might have been in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, even the kind of the Cronkite area, the Tom Brokaw, where most people were getting their information from those nightly newscasts. That is still the case here. That I know in Austria, for example, I think over 90% of the citizenry comes into contact with the public broadcaster every day in some form or another. That would either be television.
And the public broadcaster lets everybody know that because they like their funding to remain robust.
Exactly. They want the funding, and they have the best of both worlds because they also are allowed to sell advertising on top of the license fees that they get from households. So, some of these systems in Europe still have this gatekeeper function, and they would argue, well, we are the guarantors of quality journalism, which is kind of a dangerous claim, but this is the claim that they make, that they see themselves as sort of the high priests of what good journalism is, whereas people like me and others, I work for Axel Springer, which is sort of seen as in Germany as being a publishing house a little bit on the right, or some people would say very much so on the right, that we are not part of this fraternity or sorority, whatever you want to call it, of quality journalism, the way that they see it.
Fraternity, Matt. You're part of the patriarchy.
I am part of the exactly. I'm a card-carrying member. This is kind of the tension there, and they're very worried about these new offerings that are starting to emerge here, less so in television, to be honest, than online, which are kind of challenging this status quo, which a lot of people perceive to be as disinformation or not adhering to the normal standards of journalism, which, to be honest, is often true. There's a lot of commentary and that type of thing, but it is certainly something that is roiling the media business in Europe, and I think in Germany in particular right now.
But Matt, you have a reputation in the United States for being a very serious journalist, and you're really, in my eyes, the kind of the last of a dying breed. And you managed to get stories out of Europe that are enlightening and informative. How do you personally navigate this tension that you've described between the club and yourself, a serious journalist?
Well, first of all, it's very nice of you to say, Mike. Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, not everybody here would agree with your analysis.
You noticed that I learned this compliment from reporters. That's called a source sweetener.
There you go. Yeah, that's very good. That's a very good tactic. It's very effective, given how narcissistic most journalists are, including myself. Yeah, I mean, look, it means that because I tend to be a little bit more contrarian and not to go along with a lot of kind of the mainstream coverage. And if we're honest, I think most journalists, both in Europe and in the US, tend to lean to the left. And in Europe, I would say they don't even lean to the left. I mean, they're pretty deep in left-wing territory. It's sort of noticeable when somebody isn't doing that. And I have maybe a more contrarian, or definitely have a more contrarian approach than most of my colleagues. And what it will mean is, I'm not going to get sort of the same kind of access. I'm not going to get the big interviews with a lot of heads of state and what have you, because they read what I write. And, they perceive that to be maybe, somewhat, they would perceive it to be somewhat dangerous to speak to me. But, I think for what I do, that is actually okay, because I'm not in the trenches covering every twist and turn of what's happening in German politics. I'm writing primarily for an audience outside of Germany and even outside of Europe. So I have the luxury, I would say, of not depending on these people in the same way that my German colleagues do. So, I think it's actually been an advantage for me that I can look at these, events and policies that the Europeans are pursuing, maybe with a somewhat more critical eye than the local press would. And I'll give you an example. There's this energy transformation in Germany, which is now, completely blowing up in their face, where they're moving their entire energy production system, or trying to, into renewables. And, they started this back in the early 2000s. And I've been writing about this off and on for many years. and have been extremely critical and have been branded as kind of a right-wing, nut job for suggesting that this isn't the kind of sine qua non of energy policy around the world. And, not to pat myself on the back, but I will anyway. And now it's turned out that a lot of the criticism, that I'd been kind of writing about of their plans has turned out to be true. Just quickly, another example of that, I think, is our coverage of the German military, the Bundeswehr, and German spending on defense, which is something that we've been, writing about quite critically for many years, long before the all-out invasion in Ukraine in 2022. And now the Germans are kind of coming around to that, but the kind of ferocity that we were using in articles, and particularly in my analyses of German defense policy, was really an outlier in Germany. And now I would say it would be kind of conventional wisdom, if you will. So I would say it has been an advantage for us as Politico here, and for me personally to be a little bit more contrarian than the locals.
Well, let's stay then at the explaining Germany to the outside world theme, and maybe delve into Ukraine quickly. Another Axel Springer publication, the tabloid Bild, which is relatively well sourced, and I think in the security ministries in Germany, had a bombshell report titled "The Secret Plan for Ukraine," which suggested that Olaf Scholz, with the support of the White House, were gaming out how to potentially pull back this or that weapon system to pressure the Ukrainians into a negotiation. NBC News, despite the White House claiming that it was a false story, had a piece at the start of November arguing that at the last meeting of the contact group, the Americans and Europeans were approaching the Ukrainians about sussing out an end to the war, peace negotiations, how to proceed. We obviously saw Giorgia Meloni's prank call, which she thought was with the president of the African Union, where she talked about a way out. But focusing on Germany in particular, what's the mood in Berlin on Ukraine, and where does Germany stand?
Well, I think that report is actually very accurate, and I think it also reflects kind of a maxim of mine, which is that you should always look at, if you want to understand what the Germans are doing and what they intend to do, you have to look at their actions and not listen to what they're saying, because there's often a complete disconnect between the rhetoric and the facts on the ground. And they have this saying in German that you give somebody too much to die and too little to live. So you just let them kind of scrape by, which seems to be their strategy for Ukraine, and it has been from the beginning. I mean, the Germans have gone, kicking and screaming into every sort of weapons delivery since the beginning of the war, and some people might remember that their first instinct was to send Ukraine 5,000 helmets, and they acted like that was a big sacrifice on their part.
Matt,
since then,
I got to interrupt you on that, because the story is too good not to offer. I
love that saying: too much to die and too little to live.
I had a very senior German official come through Washington after Christina Lambrecht, the defense minister, made that comment about the 5,000 helmets, and this German official, whose English was not great, didn't have total command of the English language, thought the word for helmets in English was coffins. So he kept going to these meetings and saying, well, we've offered them 5,000 coffins. And by the time he came to Hudson and he said this, I interrupted him. I said, surely you mean the helmets? And he's like, yes. And I'm like, how many times he's been saying it all through Washington that they've been offering 5,000 coffins?
Oh, that's excellent.
But anyways, please continue.
Yeah. So in essence, I think that there's been from the very beginning a deep-seated reluctance on the part of the Germans to really do anything that they felt would provoke Russia. They have this very kind of ingrained fear that their weapons deliveries are going to somehow trigger Putin to launch a nuclear attack on Germany or something. And so this is the lens through which they look at all of these requests coming from Kiev for more weapons. And I think that this reluctance that they have, unfortunately, dovetails with the way Biden has approached the conflict, by giving the Ukrainians enough weapons to defend themselves, certainly to a degree, but not the kind of gear or the amount of gear that they're going to need to actually win. And that is, very much, the way the Germans see it. They just want this war to end. However it ends, they want it to disappear because they've got other priorities. And they have been, it has to be said, very generous in taking in Ukrainian refugees, war refugees, and have stepped up in financial aid and so forth. But when it comes to the weapon systems that the Ukrainians need, there still is a very, very strong reservations on the part of the Germans, and particularly on the part of Chancellor Scholz. And I don't really see that changing, to be honest.
Let me ask you about the Middle East. When I worked in the White House, which is back 2005 to 7, our best allies on Iran were the French. The French were really staunch, particularly on the nuclear question, less on some other issues, but the nuclear question, they were as strong as we were, and they held the line in Europe. And then along came the Obama administration.
Thanks to the close Bush-Chirac relationship, I assume.
Yeah. The funny thing was that Bush and Chirac hated each other, wouldn't even talk to each other.
Right.
But we there was so much work that had to be done on the issue. We developed channels. It was great for me because I was down lower, so the serious work got pushed down, and there was stuff to be done. But when Obama came in, and Obama switched the relationships in Europe on the Middle East with respect to the Middle East. And he started seeing the Middle East through pretty much the same way that Angela Merkel saw it. And there's a special kind of respect that the Germans accord to the Iranians, and they strongly believe in engagement, especially economic engagement. So they don't like the sanctions, and they don't believe in hard military pressure. At the same time, they have this special relationship with Israel as they see it. And I wonder if the situation now with Gaza is creating any tensions for them, or are they able to continue to manage that? This is all going to be very interesting. You mentioned that the chancellor's off to Dubai. The COP28 conference. I have two principles in life, and part of my personal code. I used to say, up until this crisis in Gaza, that every minute spent talking about the Palestine question is a wasted minute. And I also thought that any time spent talking about climate change conferences was a wasted minute. Now, everyone is converging on COP28, and they're all going to be talking about Gaza, and it actually matters this time. So that climate change conference is going to be, it's also going to be a Gaza discussion about what happens. Are the Germans comfortable with their position, or are they feeling a lot of pressure?
I think they're very uncomfortable with it because of what they're seeing on the streets in German cities, with a lot of the Muslim migrant community in particular going out and protesting, demonstrating in favor of Palestine, with the usual kinds of slogans that we've heard elsewhere, and including in the United States. So they are uncomfortable with it because they do feel this historic obligation to Israel, and the president of Germany was there this week, in fact, and visited a kibbutz. And you've had other officials go there, including Chancellor Scholz. So it is a bit of a a balancing act that they're trying to pull off here, because they can sense also that their own population is somewhat skeptical about the Israeli approach. But so far, the Germans have avoided being too critical, I would say. But they clearly are uncomfortable with the civilian deaths that they're seeing there. But this is also kind of typical, I would say, of their approach to the world, and explains how, you know, they can both be friendly with Iran and at the same time claim to be, you know, great defenders of Israel, because, you know, they see the world as a very complicated place, which it is, but they also believe that, you know, it's not black and white. We don't have to always choose sides and things. We can, you know, have our cake and eat it too, type of thing. So if you, in the Iranian example, if you're German and you don't believe that the Iranians really mean it when they say they want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, then you can justify continuing to do business with them, for example, or pursuing the Iran nuclear deal with the fervor that they did for so many years. They don't like situations where they're forced to actually take a stand, which, you know, also I think if you go back and look at the trajectory of what happened in Ukraine and their relations with Ukraine pre-2022 and with Russia, it explains how they could embrace the Nord Stream gas pipeline project at the same time that they were, you know, trying to negotiate some kind of peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, when everybody else, you know, was saying, you know, this is crazy. This is never going to work. It's clear what the Russians are up to. They always kind of tend to emphasize the diplomatic course, which is why I also think that things are going to come to a head between the German government and Israel at some point, because, you know, it's pretty clear the Israelis are going to continue to do what they have to do in Gaza to eradicate Hamas. And you know, the public pressure in Germany is going to only intensify, I suspect.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but really the moment that crystallized this the most to me was when Scholz, trying to leave Israel, is rushed from his plane into a shelter, and his delegation is face down on the runway as Iranian missiles and rockets fly overhead, the day that the missile embargo and the JCPOA, maybe it was the day before, expires. And of course, Germany, being one of the negotiators of the Iran nuclear deal, does have a snapback option, but it wasn't even so much as discussed. Instead, one sort of took the humiliation and then flew back to Berlin. And I didn't see a lot of shots fired at them, so to speak, in the German press.
No, it is extraordinary, and it shows this tendency on the part of the Germans, and this is true of their relations to the Iranians, and it's also true of the way that they treat the Russians, is that they are always willing to give certain countries the benefit of the doubt, no matter what happens. Now, as an American, if you are in Germany and you eat with the wrong fork or something, you know, they're appalled that, you know, what a Philistine you are. But, you know, the Iranians can, you know, send their missiles in the chancellor's direction when he's visiting Israel, and you know, they'll find a way to justify it or to have some understanding for how that might have happened. And, you know, this is what continues to happen. Just today, the Iranian American activist, Masih Alinejad, was in Berlin. She was supposed to meet with officials at the foreign ministry here, with the kind of representative who's supposed to be kind of the ambassador for human rights, if you will, in Germany. And the stipulation that this official made was that Alinejad not publish any photos of this meeting, that there not be any kind of press around this meeting, because they were clearly worried that it might rub the Iranians the wrong way. So here you have
she's
sort of,
just for the benefit of our listeners, she is the woman most associated with all of the protests over the veil. She wears her hair prominently with a flower in it,
and fits perfectly into the feminist foreign policy that Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, professes.
This is the irony. I mean, this woman Masih Alinejad, people Google it, you'll see her story, which is extraordinary. She was targeted by the Iranians in Brooklyn. They wanted to kidnap her, put her on a speedboat to a tanker in New York Harbor, and then ship her off to Venezuela and fly her back to Tehran so that they could put her on trial. That's how much they hate this woman. She's become sort of the face of the women's movement in Iran. And here you have a German foreign minister, as you say, Peter, has made feminist foreign policy her kind of trademark, and she refuses to meet with her, and even one of her lackeys, for lack of a better word, is agreeing to do so, but only if there's not any press around it. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
How do you this quality that you're describing about the Germans? You said it, and this is my impression, is that this, for lack of a better word, hypocrisy is most apparent in their relations with the Russians and the Iranians. And I get the feeling that there is a kind of, the Russians and the Iranians have a special place in the German worldview, in the German soul. Am I wrong there? How do you explain it?
No, that's absolutely right, and I think the reason is, and I guess we don't know for sure. My theory is that it has very deep cultural roots. That the Germans view Iran, for example, and they often refer to it not as Iran but as Persia, as this great civilization, as a very rich civilization, which has to be said it is in terms of its literature and fine arts, etc. And they see Russia in the same way, that it is a great civilization. They see many of the countries in between not so much as great civilizations. So, like Poland, for example, I don't think most Germans consider Poland to be a great civilization, or any of the Slavic countries for that matter, or most of the.
And they know it.
The
Poles know it.
And the Poles definitely are feeling that vibe when they're
the old Polish joke about a joke told by Poles about if Russia and Germany invade Poland simultaneously, who do you shoot first?
Yeah,
the Russian, because business before pleasure.
Oh no. Yeah, well, that's there's definitely a lot of resentment there on the part of the Poles. And I think, though, generally speaking, that if you talk to Europeans from these countries, these smaller countries between Germany and Russia, they're all a bit perplexed about why the Germans have this kind of deep-rooted affinity for the Russians. And I think it is for these cultural reasons. And and the same is true for Iran and for France.
What is it about this civilizational category? Can you say more about that?
I think it's I think I don't want to fall into stereotypes, but I think most of us, when we think of Germans, or most foreigners who've been to Germany, know some Germans, that the first thing that they associate with Germany often is the kind of arrogance of the population. It's kind of well known that Germans often think highly of themselves. And I think they see themselves still as culturally superior to most other people around the world. And it is kind of this cultural snobbery that I think is behind this, because they take other countries, other civilizations as they see them, much more seriously than they do countries that they don't regard as having the same kind of cultural history.
They have a kind of civilizational hierarchy of great civilization. They're one. The Russians are one. Who else is in that top tier category?
Well, I would say the Chinese, the Japanese in Asia, the Indians.
Are we there, or are we?
Well, no, we're not there, and I think they have sort of a love-hate relationship with the United States, which it's mostly hate. I mean, they certainly think that hate might be too strong a word, but I think they see us generally very skeptically, and they're sort of perplexed at how, the United States, as a country that is not really as rich a civilization as theirs in their eyes, could have become so successful. The dynamic between the United States and Germany is always going to be complicated.
It's a deformation of the natural order of things that we should have so much power,
exactly,
and yet not have the civilizational attributes.
Yes. And that's why when they come to the United States, typically many Germans, they'll complain about, things like the air conditioning and other things that they just can't understand, why we're so wasteful in their eyes, and the big SUVs. I mean, there are all of these, these sort of small details that they seize on to try and, make some big point about how primitive we are. But, the data don't lie, as they say, and the dynamism of the American economy and the innovation in the United States is just something that they can't even come near to matching. So they're a bit perplexed by that. But I think it also goes back to the fact that the United States defeated Germany in World War II together with its allies, obviously, and also in World War I. And so, it is a country that has been sort of subjugated by the United States to a degree. And so the relationship is much different and will always be different, I would argue, between the US and Germany than it is between the US and the UK or the US and France. I think the US and France is also, it's a good comparison here, because we have a difficult relation with France. I mean, as you were saying earlier, Bush and Chirac hated one another. I mean, a lot, you go back to de Gaulle, he had very difficult relations with American presidents. And yet, we have, I would argue, a more sort of natural rapport with the French than we do with the Germans, because the French, for better or worse, have always been our allies.
Yeah. And difficult allies sometimes are the best. Yeah, because they might be difficult and nettlesome, but they actually act and they believe.
Without the French,
power,
the United States wouldn't exist, probably, right? I mean, it's
A good illustration of what you're describing. I was recently in Bucharest. The Aspen, Romania GMF forum took place there, and as I was there, I noticed there wasn't really any German representation, and there was one panel in which they had an official German, but he was beamed in from the foreign ministry in Berlin, and the screen was above the stage, so he was sort of beamed down, looking down at the assembled Eastern Europeans. And I thought to myself, it's probably like an hour flight to get on a plane, cancel your morning meetings, come to this in person, actually speak to the Eastern Europeans. But instead, it was filled with, Bulgarians, Romanians, etc. Very little German representation. Final question, though.
Sorry, pardon me here. I got to run.
No worries. It was great to see you, Mike.
With the wonders of modern technology, Mike's evaporated here. He's been transported to another place. But I want to end with a question, Matt, which is kind of a big one, so you can take it any direction you want. But in your reporting, I noticed you were covering the collapse of Lehman and the financial crisis in 2008 while you were in New York. Then you come to Europe and you cover the debt crisis and the Greek crisis, and when that was maybe 2012, 2013. I might have my dates wrong on that. But crisis seems to follow you around the world. So my question for you is, you've written a bit about a danger coming down the pike, for example, for the German automobile industry, et cetera. How serious is this threat of German deindustrialization and German economic not collapse, but falling behind? You've already mentioned the dynamism that confuses the Germans about the U.S. And when I look at growth rates comparatively between the U.S. and Europe, there is a gap opening up that's growing by the year. That's somewhat worrisome. So tell me, are we on the verge of crisis with Germany, or is that overblown?
I know. I think it's not overblown at all. We're in the middle of a crisis, and it does feel a bit like, since I've been here. I came over in 2009 originally with the journal to Germany, and the reason was that I sort of needed a break after covering the financial crisis in the U.S. and Lehman Brothers. And as soon as I landed here, the European debt crisis kind of exploded. And spent the next several years dealing with that. So, it has to be said, though, that for many years, beginning right after that Lehman crisis, Germany did pretty well, especially as compared to most other European countries. And the reason is that it continued to provide the key goods that China needed to continue to industrialize and expand its economy. And there was this voracious demand for German capital goods in China. Now, I'm not just talking about the cars. The cars were part of it, but it was in particular machinery, which Germans are very good at making, very sophisticated machinery. And that really drove this export boom in Germany from 2010, on up until the pandemic. And the interesting thing was that, the Germans felt like, they had squared the circle, because even though there was, weakness in the United States, they could compensate for that with strong demand from Asia. And they seem to be, with their export-driven economy, which is often criticized by the U.S. and other countries because they were running surpluses with the rest of the world. They would argue, that the other people were just basically jealous of how good they were, and so on. And that led them in 2009 to introduce this what we would call a balanced budget amendment, which they call a debt break, which means that the government is not allowed to basically run a deficit above kind of a minimal amount. And that's come back to haunt them now, because the Constitutional Court in Germany has said, that the plans that they had to circumvent this debt break are illegal. And so, you're seeing this current government kind of trying to figure out now, well, how are they going to invest in their economy, do the kinds of things that you're seeing in the U.S. with the Inflation Recovery Act, and also the Chinese are investing billions to try and speed the transformation along in terms of more climate friendly industry. And the problem that the Germans have is that they've already lost a lot of ground here, because the way that they have pushed forward with their climate transformation has made energy costs so expensive. They're now 5 times what they are in the US. So if you are a German manufacturer and you're thinking about expanding because you have still, strong demand from North America, from Asia, wherever, you're more likely right now to turn your back on Germany and to build a plant in South Carolina or in Shanghai or somewhere in China than you are in Germany. So I don't think that this deindustrialization that we're seeing is going to happen overnight, but it's a gradual process that is accelerating now. And you can see it in decisions by companies like VW, which is building a new electric SUV in the US under the Scout brand. They're reviving the Scout brand, and I think that's going to be in South Carolina. The interesting thing there, though, is that they're building they're manufacturing the batteries also in North America, in Canada, and not in Germany. So if you look at the flip side of that, Tesla has built a very large auto plant just outside of Berlin, where they're churning out pretty much, I think, all of their models now. But they are bringing their batteries, which is the key technology in an electric vehicle. It's where all the added value is. They're bringing their batteries over from the U.S. and China to Germany. So Germany is becoming, for these big global manufacturers, just another place where you screw things together in the same way that, what Slovakia is right now for Germany, which is, it's a cheaper market where they can, put together their Porsches and Audis and what have you before sending them off to the rest of the world. But it is not where they're developing the key technologies. And that was always, Germany's great advantage was, the power of its engineering innovation. And over the last decade or so, it's clearly lost ground there. And in particular in the auto industry, because they sort of underestimated the demand we would see for electric vehicles. They didn't take this sort of electric vehicle revolution very seriously. And so now they're, some would say a decade behind the Chinese, for example, in this technology. And they, in fact, are having to rely on the Chinese to supply them batteries and other components. So it's very difficult to see how the Germans are going to resolve these problems in any kind of manageable time frame, especially given all the demographic pressures that they face. So in addition to all of these problems, involving innovation and the industrial policies that they pursued that have proven to be somewhat problematic, especially in terms of the price of energy and so forth. They also have this problem that the society is aging quite rapidly. They don't have enough skilled workers. And Germany, for people from places like India, other parts of the world where they have a younger population, educated population, is not an attractive place for those people to go. So they really are at a loss about what to do.
Well, Matt Karnitschnig has a first class seat on the German Titanic. You can read his missives at Politico and follow along as the ship slowly sinks into the ocean. No, but all kidding aside, thanks, Matt, for joining us on Counterbalance, and look forward to reading your work and having you back on the show in the future.
Thank you. It's been great, Peter.